La députée de Beloeil, Chambly.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beloeil, Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to start by congratulating the member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam. And as the member for Gatineau said earlier, I too was in the House during the first hour of debate on this bill. I heard the very moving comments that he made. And sometimes people forget that there are issues brought to us by our constituents. But there are also some very personal stories that motivate us. And this is one dealing with public health, an urgent public health matter. And it's very comforting to see that we can come together and do this. And we're proud in the NDP to have the same position. Now, without wanting to make any bad jokes during an important debate, we'd like to thank the Senate for the work that they did, because these amendments make sense. In fact, they will improve the bill and are such that we can support it. And we hope that the issue will be resolved quickly, because we've heard this for a long time now. We heard a member from BC talk about it. Someone who works on this file in our caucus and that's the member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford from BC as well. The Conservative member who's from Alberta who just spoke. And we often think that this is an issue primarily affecting the West. And if we look at the number of people who have died since the start of the opioid crisis, it is one that started out west, but it is moving east. So we've now seen many cases in Ontario and Quebec. So that's why it's so important for us as parliamentarians to come together and put forth the necessary legislative measures to save lives. Now, what do we have before us here, Mr. Speaker? We have a Bill C-224, which is the Good Samaritans Act, as it's called. As the Conservatives just pointed out so well, people might well ask why someone wouldn't seek help if a friend or a family member, regardless of the situation, were suffering from an overdose. Why wouldn't someone seek help? Well, it could have been because of the legal consequences. Now, unfortunately, many times in cases where overdoses are involved, young people are dealing with the consequences of taking drugs, and they are also very concerned about the legal consequences. So by putting in place a legal framework that makes it possible for a citizen or an individual wouldn't be afraid to call for help is something we need to see. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we look at the amendments brought forth by the Senate, I believe that they're very important. They help to clarify and, as I said, to improve the bill. The first one deals with clearer wording for protection from prosecution for possession. So we want to ensure that it's clear that an individual who would call 911, for example, to get an ambulance to come for one of their friends, is often the case, who's overdosing. So the person calling for assistance would not face charges. The other provisions that were changed through amendments in the Senate deal with a person who's on site during an overdose would not be charged with an offense concerning a violation of pretrial release, probation order, conditional sentence, or parole relating to an offense under subsection 4 if the evidence in support of that offense was obtained or discovered as a result of a person having been sought assistance or having remained at the scene. So the same type of exemption doesn't exist for impaired driving. However, if someone is on site or someone is a victim, and calling for assistance. So I think this is a very important aspect. And I'd like to go back to an issue that was raised earlier. It's something that we often see as part of the discussion when it comes to drug addictions and these substances. Unfortunately, there's a stigma attached to this. And what I mean by that, Mr. Speaker, is that if we look at the debate on the opioid crisis and the safe injection sites, there's a parallel that we need to draw with the bill before us. Why do I say that? Well, because it takes some political courage to go ahead with this. And that's why it's important to acknowledge the efforts and the member who has sponsored this bill. It's not about encouraging this type of behavior. It's about dealing with a public health issue, helping someone who has a health problem, who doesn't know how to find help. And with this bill, for example, it's important to have this type of measure in place to resolve the crisis that we're currently facing. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said, oftentimes this has an impact on people. Now, even if we look at the context of the debate surrounding the legalization of marijuana, oftentimes we talk about education and prevention and all of those issues. But it's all fine and well to talk about money that could be invested for education and prevention or awareness. But if we don't have the legislative framework that enables us to ensure that those people can benefit from help, seek out help, and be it under the Good Samaritan bill or through safe injection sites, then none of this would be worthwhile. So it's important to ensure that all of these steps taken, all of the efforts undertaken by the government, by Parliament, are supported. These bills are linked. Now, I'd like to cover off a few figures on the situation, Mr. Speaker. A situation that hit BC very hard, and this opioid crisis is a very serious one, and it is a public health issue. As a critic, the NDP critic for public safety, I acknowledge that we're not talking about a public safety issue. We're talking about public health, and that's why we need policies that are based on facts that enable us to deal with this type of suffering that exists. But I must admit, Mr. Speaker, that we see these problems in the news, and it's not necessarily something that I see often in my riding. And so people who are watching the debate, they really need to understand just how extensive this crisis is. In December alone in BC, a record number of deaths, over 140, more than in November 2016, 126 deaths. That is huge, Mr. Speaker. Imagine December, it's Christmas time approaching. 142 families lost a loved one because someone didn't call for assistance quickly enough. Regardless of our political stripes in this House, I don't think anyone could live with that reality on their collective conscience. This is unacceptable. These types of deaths are unacceptable. Each week in Vancouver, there are between 9 and 15 deaths through overdose. That is completely unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. So if we can support bills like this one, efforts undertaken to give us the legal framework we need so that people who need help can receive it, and to continue to support good efforts like this one that are progressive efforts to deal with this public health crisis, to eliminate it, well then I think it's our collective responsibility to support legislation like that. I want to again thank the member for Coquitlam Port Coquitlam. It's inspiring to see the efforts based on such a personal story. I want to thank the Senate as well for improving the bill. And we hope that this is just a first step in the right direction that will help us to put an end to this public health crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat. Dans l'ordre, secrétaire.